We caught up with Danny near Mother Hubbard's cupboard. Bear ran to lick our faces, but Danny stared at us angrily. Why don't you go home and leave me alone? We came to help you catch DeSilvio and Silas, Arthur said. I don't need your help. I have Bear and this. Danny took Mr. DeSilvio's gun out of his pocket. I'll kill both of them if I have to. Where did you get that? I edged closer to Arthur. There was no telling whom Danny might decide to shoot. I picked it up when DeSilvio dropped it. He said, You wouldn't kill your own father, Arthur whispered. He don't deserve to be anybody's father. Suddenly, Bear raced away, and Danny took off after him. Wait up, Bear, he hollered. Arthur and I chased them, tripping over roots and vines, stumbling down hills, ducking clumps of kudzu. Just ahead, Bear was barking and Danny was yelling. Please, I whispered, please don't let Danny shoot anybody. Snuffing with fear, I staggered after Arthur. We broke into a clearing. Mr. DeSilvio stood with his back pressed against a tree, kept there by Bear. Silas was nowhere in sight, and neither was the briefcase. Billy and Johnny weren't there either. Danny stood a few feet away, pointing the gun at Mr. DeSilvio. His hands shook, but I wasn't sure he'd pull the trigger if the man moved. Who killed my grandma? He shouted. You or my father? Mr. DeSilvio stared at him, making no effort to hide his contempt. Put down that gun, you little punk. Danny hurled a few swear words at the man, then repeated his question. Who killed my grandma? Mr. DeSilvio didn't answer. His eyes were cold, but I guessed he was more scared than he let on. He was a ruined man. Nothing could save him now. Overhead, the police helicopter circled, motor roaring, shining a spotlight down through the treetops. Someone shouted in the woods, and Arthur yelled, Over here! Over here! Mr. DeSilvio folded his arms across his chest and sagged against the tree, but Danny held the gun with both hands, the way cops do in movies and on TV. Answer me, you! More cussing. 3 policemen in bulletproof vests crashed out of the kudzu. Put the gun down, son, one shouted. But Danny kept the gun pointed at Mr. DeSilvio. Not till he answers me. Are you crazy? Arthur yelled. Do what he says. He'll shoot you if you don't. The cop scowled at Arthur. I guess he didn't think of himself as the kind of man who shot 12-year-old kids, even if they did have guns and were named Phelps. At that moment, Violet ran out of the woods, screaming at the cops. Don't shoot him, he's just a child. By now, Danny was crying. Snot dripped from his nose. His hands shook so badly, he couldn't keep the gun pointed at Mr. DeSilvio. He deserved to die, he wailed. The cop walked over to Danny and took the gun from him. We'll take care of him, son. Violet tried to hug Danny, but he pulled away from her. I'm not a child, he yelled through his tears. Meanwhile, Bear stood guard, snarling, the fur on his back standing up. He was so fixated on Mr. DeSilvio, he hadn't even noticed the police. Whose dog is that? A cop asked. I noticed he was holding a stun gun. Scared for Bear's safety, Arthur, Danny, and I ran to the dog. Somehow we managed to haul him back on his hind legs, still straining to get at Mr. DeSilvio. It took all 3 of us to hold him up. With Bear out of the way, the cops moved in, cuffed Mr. DeSilvio, and read him his rights, and led him away. As they shoved him out of the clearing, he glanced over his shoulder at Arthur, Danny, and me. He didn't need to say anything. The anger in his eyes spoke for itself. For our own good, I hoped he was facing life with no parole. Did you get Silas? Arthur asked the remaining cop. Before the cop could answer, Bear broke away from us and tore into the underbush. All 3 of us ran after the dog. If anyone could find Silas, it was Bear. Come back here, the cop yelled after us. Danny, Violet wailed. But we'd already zigged and zagged and vanished into the kudzu. It sounded as though the cops tried to follow us, but judging by the noise he made, he fell down. We heard him thrashing around in the kudzu and shouting. Overhead, the helicopter circled so low. The kudzu danced a spooky jig in the wind from the blades. The noise made it hard to hear anything else. With us on his heels, Bear headed down the path that led to Willie the whale. We thudded across the Rainbow Bridge straight into a crowd of protesters gathered around the whale's dark pond. "Get the cops," old King Cole hollered at us. "He's inside the whale." Bear tried to charge through the excited protesters, but they didn't make way fast enough. Arthur and I managed to grab his collar and stop him. "You'd better come out," Alice in Wonderland cried into Willie's gaping mouth. I noticed she was clutching a stuffed white rabbit. The Knave of Hearts seized Alice's hands and pulled her away from the whale. "What if he's got a gun?" he shouted. "The detective said he was dangerous. Didn't you hear her?" Danny pushed his way through the crowd and stopped in front of the whale. "Come out of there," he yelled. "They got you now. You ain't going nowhere but jail." If Silas answered, he was drowned out by at least a dozen cops charging out of the woods. "Clear the area," they shouted. "Clear the area." Behind them came Nina and Violet. While the protesters moved slowly back from Willie, Nina pulled Danny away and handed him over to Violet. "Keep him under control," she said, as if Danny was a raging pit bull or something. With guns drawn, the cops approached the whale. "Come out with your hands up," Phelps, one yelled. "We've got you surrounded." There was a scuffling sound inside Willie. His fiberglass sides shook a little. Slowly, the vines covering the whale's mouth moved aside and Silas crawled out. His eyes sought Danny. "Tell him, son." "I was just down here to join up with them protesters," he said. "Ain't no need to arrest me. I got the freedom of speech thing, just like everyone else." As proof, he'd held up a Save the Magic sign he'd found somewhere. At that moment, a news photographer stepped out of the crowd and began taking pictures. I noticed Arthur moving a little closer to the action. He was still determined to be in the paper. "I'm not lying for you, not after what you did to Mom," Danny yelled at his father. "Either you or that rich dude killed my grandma. I hope both of you get the chair." Silas gave Danny a look of such pure ugliness. I wondered how he stood it. If my dad ever looked at me like that, I would have melted like ice cream on a hot sidewalk. "Shush," Violet whispered, still holding Danny tight. "Let the police handle this." We watched an officer read Silas's rights, cuff him, and lead him away. I turned to high-five Arthur, but he wasn't beside me. In fact, I didn't see him anywhere. Not talking to the cops, not talking to the reporters, not posing for pictures. Just as I was getting worried, he crawled out of Willie's mouth with a big grin on his face. In his hand was the briefcase. Silas hid it under a pile of leaves. He must have planned on coming back for it. "Ha!" I said. "He's not coming back here or any other place for a long time, hopefully never." "Let's give the briefcase to Violet," Arthur said. "She should have it." Violet was sitting on a dilapidated bench beside Danny, Bear laying at their feet. But he looked up and thumped his tail when he saw us coming.